They erased Earth from every star map, but one human star remained. Part 1. Toma Vril had been a trader for 30 cycles, and in that time he had learned one simple rule. Old things were worth more than new things, as long as they were rare enough. He was a Sevari, tall and thin, with pale gray skin and 4 narrow eyes that could see in the dark. His people were known across the Dominion as traders, scavengers, and collectors of forgotten junk. Most of the junk was worthless. But sometimes, if you dug deep enough into the wreckage of dead stations and drifting ships, you found something real. That was why he was sitting in a dusty back room on the trade station Kessa's Rest, looking at a piece of old plastic covered in tiny lines and dots. "It's a star chart," said the dealer, a squat little creature named Obo who smelled of engine oil and old food. "Pre-edict. Real pre-edict, not a fake. You know how rare that is." Toma turned the chart over in his long fingers. It was cracked and yellowed, made of a material nobody used anymore. The lines on it showed stars, hundreds of them, drawn by hand in a script he barely recognized. "Pre-edict," Toma repeated. "You mean before the silence." "Before the silence," Obo said, lowering his voice like the word itself was dangerous. "From before they cleaned the maps. Every being in the Dominion knew about the silence, even if most of them didn't think about it very much. 300 years ago, the Dominion Council had ordered every record, every chart, every mention of a certain species and a certain system wiped from the galactic network. The official story was simple. There had been a species, and they had gone extinct, and their homeworld had been quarantined and then simply removed from all official records because there was nothing left there worth mapping. It was ancient history. Nobody alive remembered it firsthand, except for a few of the oldest members of the ruling species, the Kethari, who lived for centuries and rarely spoke of the past. Toma had heard the stories the way everyone had heard them, half legend, half warning. Don't ask about the silence. Don't ask what was erased. It was old, and it was gone, and asking questions about it was a good way to get flagged by Dominion security. But he was a trader, and traders were curious by nature. "Why is this worth anything?" he asked, "if it's just an old map of nothing?" Obo grinned, showing 3 rows of small teeth. "Because it's not a map of nothing. Look here." He pointed a stubby finger at one corner of the chart, near the edge, in a region marked with faded lines that Toma didn't recognize from any current star map. There was a single star circled in red ink, and beside it, in small letters, a word. Toma leaned closer. The letters were in an old form of Common, the trade language used across 1,000 systems. It took him a moment to read it. "Sol system inhabited." He frowned. "That doesn't make sense. There's no system by that name in the Dominion registry. I've checked maps like this 100 times. "Exactly," Obo said, delighted. "Because it was erased. This is one of the only charts left that still shows it. Somebody forgot to burn this one, or maybe they didn't think it mattered because it's just an old cargo hauler's backup chart, not an official record. But it's real. It's proof that something used to be there. Something the Dominion didn't want anyone to remember." Toma sat back. He had bought and sold thousands of relics in his life, most of them fakes or worthless junk dressed up to look important. But something about this felt different. The chart was old, genuinely old, the kind of old that couldn't be faked easily. And the location it marked wasn't just empty space. It was in a region of the galaxy that current maps showed as an unremarkable dead zone, a stretch of dark space with no habitable systems, no trade routes, nothing worth visiting. If this chart was telling the truth, that dead zone wasn't empty at all. Not 300 years ago, anyway. "What species were they?" Toma asked. "The ones from Sol." Obo shrugged. "Don't know, don't care. Records don't say. All I know is, whoever they were, the council decided they didn't exist anymore, and they scrubbed every mention of them so hard that even asking about it makes people nervous. You want the chart or not? I've got other buyers." Toma looked at the little red circle for a long moment. Then he paid Obo's price, which was higher than he wanted, and left the station with the chart tucked carefully into a sealed case. He told himself it was just business, A rare relic, something he could sell to a collector for triple what he'd paid. That was all. But over the next several days, as his ship drifted through the trade lanes toward his next stop, he found himself pulling the chart out again and again, staring at that little red circle. Sol system, inhabited. Inhabited by whom? And why had the Dominion gone to such trouble to erase every trace of them? He tried searching the public records for anything about a species called human or a system called Sol. He found nothing. Not a single mention, not even in the deep archives that traders like him sometimes used to track old shipping routes. It was as if someone had gone through the entire galactic network with a fine blade and cut out every thread connected to that word. That kind of erasure took enormous effort. Nobody bothered erasing something that didn't matter. Toma was not a brave person. He liked profit, and he liked staying alive, and those two things usually meant staying far away from anything the Dominion cared enough about to erase. A sensible trader would have sold the chart to the highest bidder and forgotten about it. But the dead zone marked on the chart was only 11 days from his current position, if he took his ship off the main lanes and pushed the engines harder than was strictly safe. And Toma Vril, whatever his faults, had never been able to walk away from a good mystery when it was sitting right in front of him. He changed course. The trip took longer than he expected. The dead zone lived up to its name. There were no beacons out there, no relay stations, no friendly voices on the comm. His ship's sensors, usually sharp enough to spot a coin-sized asteroid at 1,000 kilometers, started giving strange readings the closer he got. Static. Interference. Once, for almost a full minute, every screen on his bridge went completely dark, as if something out there did not want to be found. He almost turned back twice. Both times he looked at the chart, at that small red circle, and kept going. On the 12th day, his ship drifted into a wide field of dust and broken rock, the remains of some ancient asteroid belt that had been shattered long ago. The dust was thick enough to block most sensor scans, which explained why nobody had ever found what was hiding inside it. Toma slowed his engines and eased forward, watching his instruments flicker with half-readable data. Then, without warning, every system on his ship lit up red. A voice crackled over his comm, rough and clipped, speaking in a language his translator struggled to process at first. It took a few seconds for the words to come through clean. Unidentified vessel, you have entered restricted space. Reduce speed and prepare to be boarded. Do not attempt to flee, you will not survive it. Toma's 4 eyes went wide. He looked at his sensor display and saw them now, 3 sleek shapes emerging from the dust cloud around him, moving with the kind of precision that meant real pilots, real weapons, and real intent. They didn't match any ship design he'd ever seen, not Dominion, not Sevari, not any of the dozen minor species he traded with. The hulls were rough, patched together from mismatched plating, clearly built by hands that valued function over beauty. And yet something about the way they moved told him these were not primitive ships. They were fast, and they were exactly where they needed to be, closing in from 3 directions at once like they had done this 100 times before. He thought about running. His ship was fast, faster than most traders bothered to make theirs, built for exactly this kind of situation. But something told him that if he tried, he wouldn't get far. The voice on the comm hadn't been bluffing. I'm not armed, Toma said quickly, switching his own comm to broadcast. I'm a trader. I got lost, that's all. I'll leave, I won't. You will not leave, the voice cut in. Cut your engines now. There was something in the tone, not cruelty exactly, but a hard edge of readiness, the voice of someone who had said these words before to people who hadn't listened, and it hadn't gone well for them. Toma cut his engines. The 3 ships closed the distance in under a minute, forming a loose triangle around his hull. A 4th ship appeared behind them, larger, more heavily armored, clearly some kind of command vessel. A tractor beam locked onto his ship and began pulling it forward, deeper into the dust field, toward something Toma's sensors still couldn't fully resolve. As the dust thinned in patches, he began to see shapes ahead of him. Structures, metal platforms and long docking arms built into the hollowed-out husk of a massive asteroid, lights glowing warm and yellow against the darkness. Smaller ships moved between them, going about ordinary business, the way traffic moved at any busy station. It was a whole hidden world, built inside rock and dust, exactly where the official Dominion star maps showed nothing but empty space. Toma stared, his mouth slightly open, forgetting for a moment to be afraid. Whatever species had built this, they were very much alive. His ship was pulled through a wide opening in the asteroid's surface, into a docking bay lit by rows of overhead lamps. The doors sealed shut behind him with a heavy metallic sound, cutting off the view of open space. Toma's hands trembled slightly as he shut down his engines fully, following the instructions barked at him over the comm. Armed figures approached his ship from the docking bay floor. Toma pressed his face closer to the viewport, trying to see them clearly for the first time. They were bipedal, roughly his own height, though built more heavily through the shoulders and chest. Their skin came in shades he'd never quite seen before, and their faces were framed with strands of dark or pale material growing from their heads, moving slightly as they walked. Their eyes, only 2 of them, not 4, were sharp and watchful, fixed on his ship with open suspicion. They wore patched armor, mismatched but well-maintained, clearly built from whatever materials they'd managed to scavenge or craft themselves over a very long time. Toma had traded with dozens of species in his career. He did not recognize this one, and according to every record he had ever seen, this one did not exist. The airlock hissed. A voice, clearer now that he was close enough not to need the comm, called out from beyond his hull. "Open the door slowly. Keep your hands where we can see them." Toma swallowed hard and reached for the release. Whatever this place was, whoever these people were, one thing was now certain in his mind, clear enough to chase away all his fear and replace it with something closer to wonder. The Dominion had erased an entire species from every star map in the galaxy. But they had missed one star, and on that star someone had survived. They erased Earth from every star map, but one human star remained. Part 2. They took Toma through a maze of tunnels carved into the asteroid's rock, past rooms full of machinery and storage crates, and more of those 2-eyed people, all of whom stopped what they were doing to stare at him as he passed. He supposed he couldn't blame them. He was likely the first outsider many of them had ever seen up close. He was brought into a large chamber with a high ceiling, its walls lined with old metal panels and a few faded pictures that looked like they had once belonged to a much bigger, much older place. In the center of the room stood a woman, if that was the right word for a female of her species, with short gray hair, sharp eyes, and a posture that told Toma immediately she was in charge. She wore simple armor, unlike the ceremonial robes the Dominion's leaders liked to drape themselves in, and she looked at him the way a hunter looks at something caught in a trap. "My name is Alina Reyes," she said. "I command this station. You're going to answer some questions, and depending on your answers, you might get to leave here alive. Understand?" Toma nodded quickly. "I understand. My name is Toma Vril. I'm a trader. I didn't mean to find this place, I swear it. I only came because of a map." "A map," Reyes repeated, her eyes narrowed. "Show me." Toma reached slowly into his coat, watching the armed guards around him tense, and pulled out the old cracked chart. He held it out, and one of the guards took it from him carefully and passed it to Reyes. She stared at it for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she looked up at Toma, and for the first time he saw something besides suspicion in her eyes, something closer to old, tired pain. "Where did you get this?" "Bought it." "From a dealer on a trade station. He said it was pre-edict, said it showed a system that isn't on any current map." Toma hesitated. "Said there was a species called human from a system called Sol and that the Dominion erased every record of them 300 years ago. I wanted to know why. That's the only reason I came out here. I'm not a soldier, I'm not a spy. I'm just curious, and apparently that's a dangerous thing to be." Reyes was quiet for a long time, studying his face as if trying to decide whether he was lying. Finally, she set the chart down on a table beside her. "You're looking at what's left of the human species," she said. "This station and a few others hidden through this sector. We are the descendants of the people who survived the war." What war? The one your Dominion doesn't teach anyone about anymore. Ray's voice was flat, controlled, but Toma could hear the old anger sitting underneath it like a coal that had never quite gone cold. 300 years ago, Earth was a young species reaching out into the stars for the first time. We were not strong. We had maybe a dozen colonies, a handful of warships, nothing that should have worried a power like the Dominion. But the Cathari found us anyway, and for reasons that are still not entirely clear to us, they decided we were a threat. They attacked without warning. They burned 3 of our colonies before we even understood who was doing it. Toma felt something cold settle in his stomach. I've never heard any of this. Of course you haven't, that's the point. Rays crossed her arms. We fought back. We had no business winning against a fleet like theirs, not with what we had, but humans have always been stubborn about dying when other people expect us to. We held them off for 11 years. We lost most of what we had. We lost Earth itself in the end. The Dominion doesn't talk about it, but they blockaded our homeworld and starved it into surrender rather than destroy it outright, because even they weren't willing to commit that on the record. What was left of our people scattered. Some of us made it out here, into the dead zones and the dust fields where their sensors couldn't easily follow. We've been rebuilding ever since. And the erasure? Toma asked quietly. The silence. After the war ended, the Dominion Council decided the cleanest way to close the matter was to pretend it had never happened. No inhabited system called Sol. No species called human. No war, no colonies burned, no 11 years of fighting a species with nothing but grit and desperation. They removed us from history and told the rest of the galaxy we had simply gone extinct, quietly, the way a small, unimportant species sometimes does. It was easier than admitting they'd started a war against people who'd done nothing wrong, and it was safer than letting anyone learn how hard we made them work for it. Toma sat down slowly on a nearby crate, his legs suddenly unsteady. He was a trader. He dealt in old junk and rare relics and dusty stories nobody cared about anymore. He had not expected any of this to be real. So you've been hiding out here for 300 years. Hiding and building and waiting, Reyes said. We knew that someday someone might find us again. We've prepared for that every single day since the first survivors settled this rock. We have shipyards. We have soldiers. We have more ships hidden through this dead zone than the Dominion would ever guess a broken, erased species could build. We are not the same weak colonies they attacked 300 years ago. She studied him again, and this time her expression softened just slightly. The question now, she said, is what we do with you. Toma understood immediately what she meant. He had stumbled onto the single most dangerous secret in the galaxy, one that a powerful government had spent 3 centuries and enormous effort trying to erase. If humanity's continued survival became public, it would embarrass the Dominion in front of every species under their rule. It might even reveal the truth about the war, the burned colonies, the starved homeworld. That was not the kind of secret people let wander off freely. You could kill me, Toma said carefully. That would keep your secret safe another day, but it wouldn't keep it safe forever. Other traders come through those trade lanes. Other charts like this one exist somewhere in some forgotten dealer's junk pile. Sooner or later, someone else finds this place, and next time it might not be a nervous trader who wanders in. It might be a Dominion patrol. Reyes' jaw tightened, because she clearly already knew this. What would you suggest instead? She asked. Let me go, Toma said. Not to tell the Dominion. I'm not foolish enough to think that would end well for me or for you or honestly for anyone. But let me be someone who knows the truth and chooses to keep it. I can watch the trade lanes for you. I can warn you if Dominion patrols start moving too close to this region. I have contacts across a dozen systems. A hidden colony can defend against ships it sees coming. It's much harder to defend against a threat it doesn't know about until the moment it arrives. For a long moment, nobody in the room spoke. Toma could feel the guard's eyes on him, weighing whether he was worth the risk of trusting. He didn't blame them for their caution. If their history was even half of what Reyes had described, trust was not something that came easily to them anymore. Finally, Reyes turned to one of the other officers in the room. a broad-shouldered man with a scar across his jaw who had been silent through the whole exchange. "Marcus, your thoughts?" The man Marcus, apparently one of Haven's elders, judging by the way the younger guards deferred to him, studied Toma with narrowed eyes. "He came here alone," Marcus said slowly. "No warship escort, no beacon transmitting his position. If he wanted to sell us out, he would have brought company, or at least made sure someone knew where he'd gone. Instead, he flew 11 days through a dead zone by himself, chasing an old story. That's either very brave, very foolish, or honest curiosity. In my experience, those three things usually travel together." Reyes exhaled slowly and looked back at Toma. "If you betray us," she said, "there will be nowhere in this galaxy far enough for you to hide. Do you understand that?" "I understand," Toma said and meant it. "Then you'll stay here for now, under watch, while we decide how much we can trust you. If you prove useful and honest, we'll talk again about letting you go and about what role you might play for us out there." She paused. "You should know, traitor, that you are the first outsider to ever see this place and walk away breathing. Don't make me regret that." Toma nodded, still slightly stunned by everything he had learned in the last hour. As the guards led him toward a holding area to await Reyes' final decision, he glanced back once at the star chart still lying on the table, that small red circle around a system called Sol. He thought about the trade dealer, Obo, back on Kessa's Rest, who had sold him the chart without a second thought, unaware of what it truly represented. He thought about the thousands of other charts probably scattered across the galaxy, most of them scrubbed clean, but a few, like this one, still carrying a fragment of the truth for anyone curious enough to look. He did not yet know that his arrival had already set something in motion. Elsewhere, far from the dust field and its hidden asteroid, a routine Dominion patrol ship had picked up a faint, unusual energy signature near the edge of the dead zone, a trace left behind by his own engines during his approach 11 days earlier, only now drifting far enough to register on their sensors. The patrol captain, a cautious and unremarkable officer with no idea what he had just stumbled onto, filed a routine report and sent it up the chain of command, the way such reports always were. It would take a little time for that report to reach someone who understood exactly what it meant. But when it did, the peace that Haven had built over 300 years of hiding would begin to unravel, one careful step at a time. They erased Earth from every star map, but one human star remained. Part 3. The report traveled slowly, the way most routine reports did, passed from one desk to another through the Dominion's enormous bureaucracy. An unusual energy traced near a known dead zone. Nothing urgent. Nothing that would normally rise above the level of a junior analyst's afternoon task. But this particular report happened to cross the desk of an officer who had been alive for a very long time, and who remembered things most beings in the Dominion had long since forgotten. Admiral Kor Dassin was Kethari, and the Kethari lived long lives, sometimes stretching past 4 centuries. He had been a young officer 300 years ago, barely more than a cadet, when the Dominion fleet moved against the human colonies for the first time. He remembered the burning skies over those first 3 worlds. He remembered, more clearly than he liked to admit, the 11 brutal years that followed, watching a species with almost nothing fight the Dominion to a standstill through nothing but sheer refusal to stop. He remembered the final blockade of Earth itself, the slow siege that had broken the species without officially destroying their homeworld, because even the Council hadn't had the stomach for outright annihilation, not against enemies who had earned a strange kind of respect even while they were being crushed. And he remembered, most of all, the fear that had settled over the Council in the years after the war ended. Not fear of what humanity was, but fear of what they might have become if the war had gone on even a few years longer. A species that adapted that fast, that refused to break that completely, was more dangerous with time on its side than any fully grown enemy fleet. Better, the Council had decided, to erase them quietly and let the story die, than to leave any trace of an enemy that other species might someday learn to admire, or worse, learn from. Dassen had approved of the decision then. He still did now. And when the routine energy trace report reached his desk, flagged automatically because of its location near a sector his old service records still had a quiet watch order on, he did not dismiss it the way a younger officer might have. He read it twice. Then he pulled up the old, sealed archives, records so far buried in the Dominion systems that most current officers didn't know they existed, and cross-referenced the coordinates. The dead zone in question sat almost exactly where a stubborn fragment of the old human resistance fleet had vanished, unaccounted for, in the final chaotic months after Earth's fall 300 years ago. Dassen sat very still for a long moment. Then he began making calls. Back on the hidden station, Toma Vril spent his first several days as something between a guest and a prisoner, watched closely but treated with reasonable decency. He was given quarters, simple meals, and, eventually, cautious permission to move through parts of the station under escort. What he saw amazed him more each day. Haven, as the humans called their hidden home, was not a single asteroid. It was a network of them, connected by tunnels and shielded transport routes running through the entire dust field, home to what Toma guessed must be several 100,000 people, possibly more. There were shipyards carved into hollowed-out rock, where workers built and repaired vessels using scavenged parts and clever, stubborn engineering that made up for what they lacked in resources. There were farms lit by artificial suns, growing food in vast underground caverns. There were schools and workshops and quiet places where old-timers told stories to children about a green and blue world none of them had ever seen with their own eyes. Toma began to understand, slowly, that this was not a broken people clinging to survival. This was a civilization that had turned exile into purpose. Every child born on Haven grew up knowing two things without question. The galaxy believed humanity was extinct, and someday that mistake would need to be corrected, on humanity's own terms, not the Dominion's. He spent time with Marcus, the scarred elder who had spoken in his defense, and learned more of the old stories, of Earth's oceans and cities, of the war's early defeats and its later, stranger victories, of ships built from nothing turning back Dominion cruisers through sheer tactical desperation. He spent time with Elena Reyes as well, watching her run the station's defenses with a calm, exhausting precision that reminded him of a person who had never once, in her whole life, allowed herself to fully relax. "You don't trust easily," Toma said to her one evening, as they stood looking out through a reinforced viewport at the slow drift of the dust field outside. "I trust people who have earned it," Reyes said, "and I've learned that trust given too quickly gets people killed. My grandmother used to say that. She was a girl on Earth when the blockade started. She remembered the sky turning strange colors, the food running out, watching ships that used to bring supplies just stop coming. She was quiet for a moment. She survived it, made it onto one of the last evacuation ships before the surrender. She used to say the Dominion didn't just take our home. They took our right to be remembered as anything other than a footnote. That's the part that always angered her the most." Toma didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing, and simply stood beside her in silence for a while. It was 3 days later that the first sign of real trouble arrived. A Haven scout ship, running a routine patrol along the outer edge of the dust field, spotted a small Dominion vessel drifting slowly through the debris, clearly running detailed sensor sweeps rather than simply passing through. It wasn't a full patrol. It wasn't even armed heavily. But it was searching methodically in a pattern that suggested whoever sent it knew exactly what kind of anomaly they were looking for. Reyes called an emergency council the moment the report came in. Toma, now trusted enough to be present for at least some of Haven's meetings, sat near the back of the room and listened. "One ship," said a younger officer, a woman named Priya Anand who commanded part of Haven's small but capable fighter wing. "We could take it out easily. Quiet before it reports anything back." "And if it's already transmitted a status update before we reach it?" Reyes asked. "Then destroying it only confirms there's something here worth hiding. A drifting ship that stops answering its check-ins draws far more attention than a ship that simply reports finding nothing and moves on." So we let it search, Priya asked, clearly unhappy with the idea. We let it search, Reyes said, and we make sure it finds nothing. She turned to her tactical officers. Full sensor dampening across the outer stations. Redirect all ship traffic to the inner tunnels. If that scout gets close enough to see anything, I want it to see empty rock and drifting dust, nothing more. The plan worked mostly. The Dominion scout drifted through the outer edge of the field for 2 full days, its sensors finding nothing but the kind of dense, confusing debris that had hidden Haven successfully for 3 centuries. Eventually it turned and left, apparently satisfied there was nothing here worth a deeper investigation. But Toma, watching the relief settle briefly over the council room, found himself troubled by something Reyes had said almost as an afterthought. That ship didn't wander in here by accident, she murmured, mostly to herself, staring at the tactical display. Someone sent it here on purpose, searching a very specific pattern. Someone who suspected something might be out here before they even arrived. Toma thought of his own ship's engine trail, the 11 days he'd spent crossing the dead zone completely unaware anyone might notice the faint signature he left behind. He felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. That might be my fault, he admitted quietly. Reyes turned to look at him, and for a moment her expression was unreadable. Then she simply nodded, not with anger, but with the tired acceptance of someone who had long ago learned that mistakes, even honest ones, eventually came looking for you. Then we'd better assume they'll come back, she said, and next time they might bring more than one ship. She was right to worry. For days later, a second and much larger Dominion patrol entered the region, 3 warships this time, moving with clear purpose, running a far more aggressive sweep pattern than the first lone scout had. And this time, leading them personally from the flagship at the center of the formation, was Admiral Kor Dassin himself. 300 years of memory and old, unresolved fear sitting behind his eyes as he studied the sensor readings pouring in from the dust field ahead. He had been the one to order the silence 3 centuries ago. He had approved every part of the plan to erase humanity from history, rather than admit what it had cost the Dominion to nearly lose to them. If even a fragment of that species still lived out here, hidden and rebuilding all this time, he intended to finish, quietly and completely, what should have been finished 300 years earlier. On Haven the alarms began to sound. They erased Earth from every star map, but one human star remained. Part 4. The alarms echoed through every tunnel of Haven, a low rising wail that every person on the station, from the youngest child to the oldest elder, had been trained to recognize since birth. It meant one thing, and one thing only. The day they had prepared for across 300 years had finally come. Elena Reyes stood on the command deck of Haven's central station, watching the tactical display fill with red markers as the Dominion patrol pushed deeper into the dust field. 3 warships. Not a full invasion fleet, not yet, but heavily armed and clearly not searching randomly anymore. They were sweeping in a tightening spiral, exactly the kind of pattern used to corner something hiding rather than simply passing through. They know we're here, Priya said from her station, voice tight, or they're close enough to guessing that it doesn't matter. Then we stop guessing about what they know and start deciding what we do about it, Reyes said. She turned to the room. Full defense posture. Evacuate all non-essential personnel to the deep shelters, every combat pilot to their ships. Marcus, I want the elders, and the children moved to the 3rd ring immediately. Marcus nodded and moved quickly toward the door, pausing only long enough to grip Toma's shoulder briefly. Stay close to the command deck, traitor. You've seen enough of us now to understand what's coming. Maybe you can help. Toma, who had spent his whole life avoiding exactly this kind of danger, found himself nodding anyway. Within the hour, the full weight of Haven's defenses had come alive. Toma watched in quiet amazement as ships he hadn't even known existed emerged from hidden docks throughout the dust field, dozens of them, then hundreds, small and swift fighters built from scavenged parts, alongside a handful of larger vessels that had clearly been constructed and hidden away for exactly this moment. It wasn't the fleet of a broken, extinct species. It was the fleet of a people who had spent 3 centuries preparing for a war they always believed would eventually find them again. "You've been building this the whole time," Toma said quietly, watching the display fill with friendly markers alongside the approaching Dominion ships. "Every generation added something," Reyes said. "Every scrap of metal we could scavenge, every old design our engineers could improve. We knew that when this day came, we couldn't win with numbers or firepower alone. The Dominion has more ships in one fleet than we could ever hope to build. So we built for something else instead. We built to survive long enough and hurt them badly enough that finishing us would cost more than they were willing to pay." On the Dominion side, Admiral Dassin studied his own sensor readings with a stillness that unsettled even his own bridge crew. The moment his lead scout ships entered the dense heart of the dust field, dozens of unknown contacts had bloomed across his display, emerging from what his charts insisted was nothing but empty, uninhabited rock. "Confirmed contacts," his tactical officer reported, voice unsteady. "Admiral, there are hundreds of them." Dassin said nothing for a long moment, staring at the display. 300 years and they had not simply survived. They had grown. "Bring the fleet to combat readiness," he said finally, his voice flat and controlled despite the small, cold knot forming in his chest. "And send word back to Council Command. Tell them exactly what we found. Tell them the erasure was incomplete." The first shots came within the hour, fired not by the Dominion, who were still cautiously probing the edges of Haven's territory, but by Haven's own forward fighter squadrons, using the dense dust field as cover to strike fast and vanish before the larger, better-armed Dominion warships could bring their full firepower to bear. It was exactly the kind of fighting Haven had trained for across 3 centuries. Hit hard, retreat into the debris, let the enemy's advantage in raw power count for nothing against terrain they didn't understand and couldn't easily track through. Toma watched from the command deck as Priya's squadron darted between drifting rock formations, drawing one of the Dominion warships into a narrow debris channel, where its heavier shields and weapons became almost useless against the swarm of smaller, faster human fighters closing in from every angle. The warship's return fire tore through the dust field wildly, destroying rock and dust more often than it found its actual targets, while Haven's fighters picked apart its weaker rear shielding piece by piece. It was working. For the first several hours, it was actually working. But Dassin was not a young or careless commander, and he adjusted quickly. He pulled his ships back from the dense debris entirely, refusing to be drawn any deeper into terrain that favored his enemy, and instead began a slow, methodical bombardment of the dust field's outer edges, grinding down Haven's cover rock by rock, making the battlefield smaller and more exposed with every passing hour. "He's not trying to win a quick fight," Reyes said grimly, watching the tactical display shift. "He's trying to strip away our advantage until there's nowhere left to hide." "Can you stop that?" Toma asked. "Not with 3 ships, no," Reyes admitted. "But he only brought 3 ships because he wasn't sure yet what he'd find out here." "That's changing fast." She was right. By the second day of fighting, additional Dominion warships began arriving at the edge of the dead zone, summoned by Dassin's urgent reports. What had begun as a patrol skirmish was quickly becoming a full engagement, and Haven's carefully hoarded resources, built up patiently across generations, were being spent far faster than they could ever be replaced. It was during a brief lull in the fighting, as exhausted pilots returned to refuel and rearm, that Toma finally understood the full shape of what he had stumbled into weeks earlier with nothing more than an old star chart bought on a dusty trade station. This was not simply a hidden colony defending its secrecy. This was the final chapter of a war that had never actually ended, only paused for 300 years while both sides quietly waited to see who would find the other first. He found Marcus in one of the lower tunnels, helping organize supplies for the exhausted defense crews, and asked the question that had been sitting in his mind since the fighting began. "Why does the Dominion fear you this much? You were never anywhere close to their equal in strength, not during the First War and not now. Why go to all this trouble then and now just to erase and destroy people who were never truly a threat to an empire their size? Marcus paused his work and looked at Toma with tired, steady eyes. Because strength was never the thing that frightened them, he said. It was how we kept fighting after every reasonable species would have simply surrendered. We lost world after world, and we kept building more ships out of scrap. We lost most of our fleet, and the survivors just kept flying with whatever was left. Even after Earth fell, after the blockade broke us, small groups like the ones who founded this place kept finding ways to resist, to hide, to rebuild. The Dominion has ruled 100 species for a very long time, largely because most of those species learn quickly when they've been beaten, and they stop fighting once the outcome is clear. We never learned that lesson properly. I think, in the end, that frightened them more than any weapon we ever built. A species that simply refuses to accept defeat, even when defeat is the only reasonable outcome, is very hard for an empire like the Dominion to plan around. Toma thought about that for a long moment, watching the tired, determined faces of the crews resupplying their ships around him. Preparing to return to a fight they had almost no realistic chance of winning outright, and yet clearly had no intention of abandoning. Back on the command deck, Reyes stood watching the tactical display grow steadily more crowded with Dominion markers, her expression carefully controlled even as the numbers grew worse with every passing hour. Priya approached her quietly, casualty reports in hand, her face pale. "We're losing ships faster than we can replace them," Priya said quietly. "At this rate, in another 2 days, maybe 3, we won't have a fleet left to fight with at all." Reyes said nothing for a moment, still staring at the display. Then a new signal appeared on the sensors, one that made her entire posture shift, the tired calm suddenly replaced by something sharper and more focused. "Admiral Dassin is repositioning his flagship," she said slowly, reading the data as it updated. "Pulling it back from the front lines, deep behind his support ships." She paused. "That's not a retreat pattern, that's a ship preparing to power up something big." Toma, who had rejoined her on the command deck, felt a chill run through him. He had heard rumors during his years as a trader, whispered stories about weapons the Dominion possessed, but almost never used, held in reserve for situations their council considered truly desperate. He had always assumed they were exaggerations, the kind of dark legend traders told each other to make their travels feel more dangerous than they really were. "What kind of big?" he asked quietly. Reyes's jaw tightened as she studied the readings pouring in from her sensor officers, watching an enormous surge of power begin building deep within Dassin's flagship, far larger than anything a standard warship should have been capable of generating. "The kind," she said slowly, "that isn't meant for fighting a fleet at all." On the display, the massive energy signature continued climbing, steady and deliberate, aimed not at Haven's scattered fighter squadrons, but directly at the heart of the dust field itself, toward the ancient, hollowed-out asteroids that thousands of human lives called home. Admiral Corps Dassin had decided, after 300 years of quiet regret over an erasure left incomplete, that this time there would be no survivors left behind to someday be found again. They erased Earth from every star map, but one human star remained. Part 5. The weapon powering up inside Admiral Dassin's flagship was old, older than Dassin himself, built during a darker period of Dominion history when the Council had briefly considered ending troublesome conflicts through methods too extreme for open use. It had been sealed away for centuries, brought out now only because Dassin, in his old age and his old fear, had convinced the Council that this single situation justified breaking that long silence. A weapon capable of collapsing the gravity of a small stellar body. Enough, aimed correctly into the heart of a dense asteroid field like the one hiding Haven, to crush every hollowed-out rock, every tunnel, every hidden life within it, all at once. On Haven's command deck, Reyes stared at the readings with a cold, focused calm that hid the fear tightening in her chest. "How long until it's ready to fire?" she asked. 18 minutes, her tactical officer answered, "maybe less." 18 minutes was not enough time to evacuate a population of hundreds of thousands from their homes of 3 centuries. It was barely enough time to decide what to do at all. Options, Reyes said sharply, looking around the command deck. We can't reach that flagship in time, Priya said. It's too far behind their support ships, and our fighters are already stretched thin holding the front line. Then we don't go through the front line, Toma said suddenly. Every head on the command deck turned toward him. He was still in many ways an outsider here, a traitor who had stumbled into a war that wasn't his. But in this moment, something in his voice made even Reyes pause and listen. I've flown supply routes through debris fields worse than this my whole career, Toma said. My ship isn't built for combat, but it's fast, and it's small, and it's built to slip through gaps a warship would never risk. If there's any path around their formation, through the thickest part of the dust where their sensors struggle most, I can find it faster than anyone else here. Get me close enough to that flagship, and maybe there's a way to stop this before it fires. Alone? Marcus asked, alarmed. Against a fully crewed Dominion command ship. Not to fight it, Toma said, to buy time. If I can get close enough to broadcast directly into their command channels, I can force a response, make them talk instead of simply firing. Or maybe I find a weak point in their shielding your ships could actually hit before it's too late. I don't know exactly what I'll find, but sitting here doing nothing certainly won't stop that weapon. Reyes studied him for a long moment, weighing the risk against the alternative, which was watching everything her people had built across 300 years be crushed in a matter of minutes. Go, she said finally. Priya, give him whatever escort you can spare without breaking the front line completely. The rest of us keep that fleet as occupied as possible. Every second we buy him matters. Toma's small ship shot away from Haven's docking bays, weaving instantly into the densest part of the surrounding dust field, exactly the kind of terrain his years as a trader had taught him to read like a second language. 2 Haven fighters flanked him loosely, clearing what obstacles they could while trying to avoid drawing full Dominion attention toward their path. It was not an easy journey. Twice, Dominion patrol ships spotted them and gave chase, forcing sharp, desperate maneuvers through narrow channels of drifting rock that left Toma's hands white-knuckled on the controls. One of his 2 escorts was lost in the second encounter, destroyed covering his approach, and Toma forced himself not to think about it, forced himself to keep flying, because stopping now would make that sacrifice meaningless. With just under 6 minutes left before the weapon reached full charge, Toma's ship broke through the last screen of dust and debris, and Admiral Dasson's flagship loomed directly ahead of him, massive and dark against the stars, its forward section glowing with the terrible light of the weapon nearing completion. He opened every comm channel his ship possessed and broadcast as wide and as loud as his systems allowed. Admiral Dasson, my name is Toma Vril. I'm not human and I am not part of this war, but I have spent the past several weeks living among the people you are about to destroy, and I am telling you now, in front of whoever else might be listening on these channels, that they are not who your council believes them to be. They are not a threat waiting to grow into your enemy. They are people. They have built farms and schools and homes inside dead rock because your empire left them no other choice 300 years ago. If you fire that weapon, you are not finishing an old war. You are committing a slaughter, and I will make certain every species under Dominion rule hears about it. For a long, tense moment, there was only silence on the channel. Then Dasson's voice came through, cold and controlled, though something beneath it sounded almost tired. You understand nothing, traitor. This is not about what they have built. It is about what they refuse to stop becoming, even after they should have surrendered. That refusal is the most dangerous thing I have ever encountered in 3 centuries of service, and I will not leave it alive to spread. Then you're afraid, Toma said, of people simply wanting to survive. That's not a threat, Admiral. That's just what every living thing does given the chance. The weapon's charge indicator, visible even from Toma's ship, continued climbing steadily upward, unmoved by words. Dasson had made his decision long before this conversation began, and nothing Toma said seemed likely to change it now. But Toma's broadcast had not only reached Dassin's flagship. It had reached every open channel within range, including the wider Dominion communication relays that Toma, during his years of trading, had learned to tap into through old smugglers' tricks most legitimate captains never bothered to learn. His words and the desperate urgency behind them were now spreading outward across the sector, picked up by traders, by monitoring stations, by curious ears belonging to a dozen different species who had never been given any reason before to question the official story of a species called human that had simply, quietly, gone extinct 300 years ago. Word reached Ray's on Haven's command deck, just as the weapon's timer ticked down toward its final minute. "Commander, we're picking up new contacts entering the dead zone," her sensor officer reported, voice startled. "Multiple unknown signatures, non-Dominion configuration. Wait, I'm reading Sevari trade vessels and... Commander, there are Dominion member species ships breaking formation from Dassin's support fleet. Several of them are refusing engagement orders." Toma's broadcast, amplified and repeated across every channel it touched, had done something neither he nor Ray's had fully anticipated. Species long uneasy under Dominion rule, who had quietly wondered for generations what other old stories the Council might have buried, saw in this moment a truth too large and too public to ignore. Sevari trade captains, moved by nothing more than the same stubborn curiosity that had first sent Toma chasing an old star chart, began arriving at the edge of the dead zone, broadcasting the unfolding crisis further still. And within Dassin's own fleet, crew members who had spent their whole service believing in a clean, justified history began to hear, for the first time, the desperate voice of a captured population begging simply to be allowed to survive. On the bridge of the flagship, Dassin stared at his own tactical display, watching support ships break formation one by one, watching his own junior officers exchange uncertain glances behind him. "Admiral," his weapons officer said quietly, hand hovering over the final firing control, voice unsteady in a way it had never been before. "The weapon is ready, awaiting your order." Dassin looked at the crushing silence rising slowly around him. At the Empire he had served faithfully for 3 centuries beginning, in this single moment, to question the story he had helped build to hide an old, uncomfortable truth. He thought of the burning colonies he had watched as a young officer, and the stubborn, exhausted survivors who had refused to stop fighting long after any reasonable species would have given up. He thought of the word Toma Vril had used, again and again, across the open channel. "People, stand down," Dassin said finally, his voice heavy and quiet. "Power down the weapon." His weapons officer hesitated only a moment before complying, visible relief crossing several faces around the bridge. It was not mercy, not entirely. It was an old man finally admitting, after 300 years, that the thing he had spent his whole life afraid of had simply been people who wanted to live. The battle did not end instantly. It took several more tense hours of careful negotiation, mediated awkwardly between Ray's, Dassin, and the small but growing crowd of outside witnesses who had gathered at the edge of the dead zone, before a fragile ceasefire finally held. Dassin's own council, faced now with a story spreading too widely and too publicly to bury quietly a second time, recalled him for review, his long service ending not in disgrace exactly, but in the uncomfortable silence of an empire forced to reckon with a truth it had worked very hard to erase. In the weeks that followed, the story of Haven and of the species called human spread across a dozen systems, then 100, carried by traders and journalists and curious minor species eager to understand what exactly their rulers had been hiding from them for 3 centuries. The Dominion Council, under mounting pressure from its own uneasy member species, was eventually forced into a position it had never expected to face, formally acknowledging that the species once known as human had not gone extinct after all, and that the ancient star maps, scrubbed clean 300 years earlier, would need to be corrected. Elena Reyes stood once again on Haven's command deck, weeks later, watching a new signal arrive across the station's restored public network access, something Haven had never before dared to use openly. On the Galactic Star Registry, updated for the first time in 3 centuries, a small marker appeared in a region long shown as empty, dead space. Sol system inhabited. Beside it, a new entry, one that had never existed before. Haven colony, human species, confirmed. Tome of Rill stood beside her, his 4 eyes fixed on the same display, feeling a strange, quiet pride he hadn't expected to feel over a war that had never truly been his own. "You did this," Reyes said quietly. "One traitor, chasing an old map because he couldn't stand not knowing what it meant." "I just asked a question," Toma said. "You and your people did the rest. 300 years of refusing to disappear quietly, that's what actually changed things. I just happened to be curious enough to notice." Reyes allowed herself a small, tired smile, the first Toma had seen from her since the day he'd first been dragged, terrified, onto this very station. "Then let it be known," she said, looking out at the star field beyond the viewport, at a galaxy that would now, finally, have to remember the truth it had once tried so hard to forget. "They erased us from every star map they controlled, but they never quite managed to erase us from existing. And now everyone will know it." Outside, scattered across the dust field that had hidden and protected them for 3 long centuries, the lights of Haven's hidden shipyards and homes continued burning steadily, no longer entirely hidden, no longer entirely alone. One human star, refusing even now to go dark.